could. There were two mysteries about Joseph. Number one was, why would he come all the way to Korea to learn Korean? He actually passed the highest level of the national Hanja exams, which is the Chinese characters to the Korean language. Very difficult, like learning the Latin roots to English.
Oh.
And yet he couldn't speak Korean at all. And then why would he choose to die all alone? He wanted to die in Korea, refused to have a funeral, laughed at me when I confessed and I thought after we became friends I would cry, without family or friends in a foreign country. So this piece is called Jealousy and Adultery, and there are two epigraphs. For love is as strong as death, its jealousy as enduring as the grave, from Song of Solomon. And from the rapper Drake, jealousy is just love and hate at the same time. To my surprise, Joseph was ridiculously blasé about death. Blithely, almost stupidly unafraid, as if death were a tedious social function he was being forced to attend. When he first heard that he had terminal cancer, his initial reaction was, he claimed, joy. The happiest day of my life, he crowed. I didn't believe him at first, but later I came to realize that he, in fact, believed it to be true. Why wasn't he afraid? His explanation was that for most of his life, he'd had an early premonition of death. What did he mean? I listened to a lot of death metal when I was a kid, he said. When he underwent surgery to remove one of his lungs, he actually told the Korean surgeon to play the thrash band Slayer in the operating room. Throughout our friendship, Joseph would thwart almost every serious attempt I made to discuss death. He once paused, cocked his head, and looked at me. 42 years is long enough, eh? At his apartment, he played me a scene from the movie The Invention of Lying, where the protagonist, played by Randy Gervais, is an atheist who tells his dying grandmother that heaven will have ponies made of gold, and everyone will live in giant mansions, and everything will smell like cookies. Every now and then, Joseph would smile and make a sarcastic crack about the mansions of heaven. I thought there'd be some transcendent experience, something reverent, magical, or profound that would happen as Joseph approached death, but no. There'd be no cliched redemption story, no Tuesdays with Maury, no last lecture, no Hallmark TV special epiphany. In fact, when we did talk about God or faith, Joseph would either interrupt me with an abrupt question or puzzle me with a non sequitur like, was Paul the first pope? Once he leaned over and lifted his finger to my nose. Smell this, he said. It was stained with medicine. More often than not, he'd just shrug, take a swig of beer, and dismiss dying as if it were as boring as talking about the weather. If Joseph taught me anything, it was that death could be anticlimactic and banal. In the beginning, Joseph insisted on pursuing other women. My girlfriend thinks that jealousy is the same as love, he complained. I'm trying to explain to her it's not. He showed me a private notebook in which he'd written, in his messy cursive, a personal manifesto. At the top, scrawled in block letters, was the title, Jealousy and Adultery. It was in the form of a letter to his Korean girlfriend, Haejun, in which he tried to explain that these were the two most important forces in life. The manifesto was a rambling jumble of contradictions, declaring that, on the one hand, one shouldn't get hung up on being jealous for seeing other partners. Yet, on the other hand, I learned he'd been bitterly betrayed by his ex-wife before coming to Korea. His brother later filled me in on some of the details, but before he came to Korea, he had married a Korean woman in the States, but she had cheated on him with another Korean man. Ultimately, she'd wanted a pure-blooded Korean child and had asked for a divorce. Joseph had been devastated by the affair, but still in love with her, he was loath to let her go. So reluctantly, he granted her the divorce, even gave her $40,000 of his life savings, then packed everything up and flew to South Korea. He was determined to learn the language and prove to her he could be Korean. On the plane over, he'd sat next to Haejun, and that's how they met and started the relationship. Only Joseph insisted on keeping it an open one. At first, heartbroken and worn down by his insistent demands, Haejun tearfully gave in. She'd actually call the other women he'd flirted with and asked them to take care of him. I vehemently sided with Haejun. Haltingly, I explained that it was perfectly reasonable to be jealous if you were in love with someone, that you wouldn't want to share that person with anyone else. In the Old Testament, in fact, idolatry is literally equated with adultery, a spiritual betrayal. All the prophets railed against it. And as for jealousy, I pointed out, God himself says, I am a jealous God. A few weeks later, I was gratified when Joseph told me he'd given up flirting with other women. He'd stick with Hijri, he said. I had a sneaking suspicion that it was mainly because he just couldn't get laid with anyone else. But it marked a breakthrough in our friendship. A door had been opened, and his relationship with Hijri had changed. After several years, I finally got a chance to meet her. Like Joseph, she was divorced and in her late 40s. She had high cheekbones and a high forehead, her hair pulled tightly back like a severe ballet instructor. Her nose was pointed and thin, and despite the smooth, poreless skin, her expression was taut with years of hardship that her makeup couldn't hide. She called me on the phone once, soon after Joseph had given up chasing other women. Her voice was much softer than I imagined. Polite and shy, she sounded grateful and kind, slipping into the role of an actual wife. She'd heard Joseph talk about me, and I got the sense that our relationship was somehow comforting to her. Over the phone, Hijri thanked me and said, please continue to take good care of Joseph. 1 year passed, and then another, and then another. Somewhere along the way, I got used to the idea of Joseph surviving. By the 3rd year or so, it was easy to turn my mind to other things. With his absurd insouciance, it seemed that maybe he wouldn't die after all. But by the 4th year, the tumor on Joseph's heart grew into the shape of a long, slender hand cupping the right atrium and ventricle. His x-rays, he said, were all dark, just layers of black shadow, slide after slide. It took a while before he could see his heart. The doctor had hinted to Joseph that sooner rather than later there'd be nothing more he could do. One thing did happen toward the end. It was small, and like Joseph, shot through with his typical bluntness, but in hindsight, it was so articulate and holy. It was a moment that I remember as being reverent, almost sacred, so heartfelt and genuine that it didn't strike me as odd at the time. It was February 2013. I met up with Joseph near my apartment. A frigid cold had swept the country. He cursed the slippery snow as we skated our way to a cafe, cranky that we had to walk so far. Exhausted, he lay his head on the table and didn't want to talk. I had seen him many times after chemo, but this was definitely bad. His face was swollen, his eyes watery. I started to read a book while he rested. After a few chapters, I turned to look over at him. He started talking about his sex life, something he was prone to do. He was secretly taking Viagra, something he shouldn't have been doing, but he was eager to let me know all the details. I keep a stash at home, he said. Take some, okay? I want you to have it. You only need a little, though. I use a penknife to cut it in half. Otherwise, you'll be walking around all day with a hard-on. Now, in the cafe, his face framed by the soft fuzz of his growing hair, he looked almost beatific. He spoke in a hushed voice and had a distant look to his face, even though he was speaking directly to me. I tell her what I love about her, and she tells me what she loves about me. He smiled to himself. I put down my book and gave him my full attention. I tell her what I love about her, and she tells me what she loves about me. I leaned in closer to hear what he had to say. What was it? My big dick, her tight pussy.
Oh my God.
We're perfect for each other, Charles. We said all this while we were fucking. I fuck once a day, Charles. I used to fuck 3 times a day, but now I'm so tired. It's the one thing I look forward to each and every day. He was smiling, almost shy, but wistfully relishing in the timelessness of this most intimate moment. I can't describe it except to say that it was beautiful. I found myself smiling back at him. Finally, I teased him by reminding him how years earlier when we first met, he'd been so determined to sleep with other women. He smiled sheepishly. Yeah, I wanted to leave her in the beginning. I didn't think it'd last. That it was just a temporary thing. But I love her so much, he continued. She comes home now and she's out of her clothes in 5 minutes. One time she came home and she slipped off her panties and we started fucking. She'd forgot to take off her coat. He laughed. I felt strangely pleased for Joseph, a mixture of satisfaction, admiration, maybe even pride. I was happy that he was happy. I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder. In the end, Joseph finally slipped away in a morphine haze at St. Paul's Catholic Hospital. The only hospital in Seoul that agreed to give him the larger doses of morphine that he requested. I was grateful that he hadn't died of a heart attack, The doctor had told him that the cancer would eventually seize his heart, and he'd probably just collapse in the middle of the street. It was a terrible way to live, knowing you had a time bomb ticking inside your chest. Every time he grew short of breath, he said he thought it was the end. When I arrived at the hospital, I saw Haejin sitting on a bench in a basement office. She looked as though she were waiting at a train station. Joseph's belongings were gathered in a large plastic trash bag on the floor. Haejin was red-eyed and sniffling, a crumpled handkerchief wrapped tightly around her knuckles. I went over and sat next to her. For a few minutes, we sat in awkward silence. She turned to me and apologized in Korean. "I'm sorry," she said, "I forgot to bring it." I looked up at her confused. She smiled and punched my arm. "He wanted you to have his Viagra." The next day, there was a small ceremony held at the hospital mortuary. Joseph had been placed on a metal table at the center of the room with stainless steel sliding drawers on the far wall. They dressed him in his brother's stained tweed suit with a vest and tie. His mouth was slightly open, his head tilted back. A thin stubble remained. He still looked alive. We were asked to help place the body in a wooden casket. I slid my hands under Joseph's thigh, felt the soft chill of his muscle, and together with the staff and his father and brother who'd flown in from the States, we lifted him from the table and gently lowered him into the coffin. It was the first time I'd ever touched the dead body of someone close to me. Before they placed the lid on the casket, Haejin asked for a moment to be alone. We exited the room and sat on the bench outside. Through the glass window, we could see her standing behind his head. She leaned over and for a few moments caressed his face, stroked his cheeks. Then cupping her hands around his chin, she bent down and tenderly began to kiss his face. Throughout it all, it was Haejin who had been faithful. She was the one who wanted Joseph to live, more than in fact than he did himself. She was the one visiting him during his chemo sessions, arguing with doctors, arguing with Joseph, demanding explanations and translating for him as he dealt with hospital staff and medical bills. In hindsight, to witness the way he'd spoken about her in that cafe before he died, this comforted me. I was glad he'd had that in his life. I was glad that he had decided to stay faithful to Haejin. He had found love in Haejin's arms, a love that was jealous and powerful. Joseph had been right. I hadn't cried at his funeral. But later, as I wrote all this down and remembered Haejin standing above him, gently covering his face with kisses, I broke down and wept.